Here comes the devil. Oh, here comes the devil. Oh, here comes the devil. Oh, the devil with the devil says I. You're so afraid of old man Satan. Now why don't you stop your hesitating? You're gonna be a long time dead. So the devil with the devil says I. You're always giving me the dickens, telling me your life's no easy pickings. But just as long as I have fun, well, the devil with the devil says I. Hey everybody, my name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this is the New Movie Diary, a cinema criticism series in which I review recent, new, and up-and-coming film releases and attempt to give you the straight facts about them in my humble opinion. I'm back on my bullshit as far as self-curated double features, and I had the opportunity for a fairly decent one last week when I caught up with both Late Night with the Devil and Immaculate. Two films, especially the former one, getting quite good reviews, though I'm afraid that in both cases that, while I think I can generally find enough in both of them to recommend generally, aspects that will probably scratch an itch for a lot more people than someone with my own peculiar nitpicks and lack of satisfaction, I'm finding myself being the outlier on both of them. Part of this might just be residual disappointment coming out of last week when I saw Love Lies Bleeding, which I'm still going to advocate as being the major must-see of this month in major new releases. Anything coming after that was probably not going to look terribly remarkable in contrast, but I'm going to try my best to be even-handed in this review, and hopefully some of y'all out there who, just from what evidence I can glean, especially if you are a fan of horror films in general, are more likely to get more out of these two films than I did, you can maybe lend me some perspective on what resonated with you about these two films that didn't really quite hit home for me. Kicking things off with Late Night with the Devil, written, directed, and edited by brothers Colin and Cameron Cairns. This is a period horror which starts out with a long, elaborate framing device, somewhat in the conventional found footage or horror faux documentary mold, although frankly I think the Cairns' writing and presentation of this opening, especially because of how much of the opening screen time of the film it takes, to an arguably gratuitous and consciously self-indulgent extent, the style of it, the tone of it, especially in the narration, it makes me think a lot more of the narration, oddly enough, in Quentin Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. There's also something of a Rob Zombie quality to it that sort of puts you in the frame of mind that, insofar as this film is going to be filled with a lot of period affectations, we really shouldn't be taking it too seriously as a work of horror that is terribly concerned with you buying it as a presentation of a period in horror or in film and television more broadly. It's gearing you up for a work that is sort of going to be playing with that sense of more of a ephemeral impression of a period and a kind of popular entertainment, as well as a kind of postmodern collision of aesthetic conventions of both past and present media. And depending on who you are, and this is sort of the camp that I'm personally in, this might actually prove to be one of the more disappointing aspects of Late Night, and I know I'm kind of right out of the gate going into a digression about the style before we get into the plot, but I think if you're going to get the most out of Late Night with the Devil, you really need to pay way more attention to this opening framing device, not just for the narrative content, but for its kind of atemporal postmodern quality. You need to be paying way more attention to that than anything having to do with the specific period in which much of the action actually takes place, because it is, I think, very overtly foreshadowing a climactic stylistic shift that, for me especially, calls to mind another seminal bit of retro horror, that of course being Ty West's The House of the Devil from 2009. Even if it wasn't deliberate, there's a lot of aesthetic echoes between the climaxes of both of these films, as well as thematic ones, which will make more sense once I finally finish with this digression and get back to actually telling you all what the this movie is about. Anyway, so the plot, set in the late 70s, David Dastmalchian stars as Jack Delroy, the host of a late-night variety talk show called Night Owls that is initially quite successful, though consistently lagging behind its major ratings rival, The Tonight Show, starring Johnny Carson. Jack is presented as a very popular but fame-hungry figure whose desperation to join the elite inner circle of celebrity and financial success even takes him to the Bohemian Grove. This is a real-life campground belonging to the Bohemian Club, which is a gentleman's organization and secret society that boasts the membership and invitation of not only artists and musicians, but also prominent business leaders and U.S. politicians, that every year hosts a 2-week-long encampment at Bohemian Grove in which they participate in secretive occult rituals, long the stuff of conspiracy theories, and especially beginning in the 70s, the heart of a lot of the satanic panic regarding the apparently unholy occult union of America's elites that is perpetuated in conspiracy theories to this very day. Now, around the time that Jack attends the Bohemian Grove encampment, his wife Madeline, Georgina Haig, contracts lung cancer. With the ratings of Night Owls plummeting already, Madeline dies, and Jack takes a year-long hiatus from the program before returning for the 6th season in 1977. In a last-ditch effort to reclaim their competitive status during Sweeps Week at the end of October, Jack decides to do an occult-themed episode of their program for Halloween. Guests include Christo, a psychic played by Faisal Bazi, who claims to be able to communicate with the dead. There's also Carmichael the Conjurer, played by Ian Bliss, a sort of James Randi-styled stage musician turned occult skeptic who's there to be the humbug who attempts to expose the conventional trickery used by spiritualists and occultists to manipulate the uncritical masses. And finally, June Ross Mitchell, played by Laura Gordon. She's a parapsychologist there to promote her as yet unpublished book, Interviews with the Devil. She and her teenage patient Lily, played by Ingrid Torelli, are the centerpiece of the program, June claiming that Lily, who was raised in a militant satanic cult. We get some interesting faux archival material of a documentary that June produced, which portrays this group as something like a weird mixture of Anton LaVey's Church of Satan as well as the Branch Davidian cult from the late 90s. There's that theme again of atemporal collision there. June claims that Lily, the survivor of the cult's mass suicide after a police raid on their suburban compound, is possessed by a demon who Lily dubs Mr. Wriggles, because in very obvious Freudian terms, he just sort of wriggles inside me and then wriggles out. And the centerpiece of this program, and as you might expect, the epicenter of a lot of the supernatural chaos that's about to be broadcast across American airwaves, has to do with this interview with the devil. And as a framing device, Late Night with the Devil is presented as a faux documentary investigating the strange events of that night on Halloween 1977, using both the live broadcast episode as well as interstitial black and white behind-the-scenes footage recorded during commercial breaks. Right off the bat, I want to say that there are not only some quite good qualities to Late Night with the Devil, but some downright excellent ones. This is neither of the Cairns brothers' first rodeo as far as feature-length horror films. In fact, it's their third feature film following 100 Bloody Acres from all the way back in 2012 and Scare Campaign all the way back in 2016. But with gaps like that in your resume, and especially considering how much more obviously ambitious as a technical achievement Late Night is, it might as well not be unlike Ty West's House of the Devil or Jeremy Saulnier's Blue Ruin, which is to say, this is clearly their true debut in terms of their honing their craft so that they're not just making movies, but clearly and boldly projecting this vision as commercial artists, announcing themselves as certified filmmakers, where you don't look at what they did in the past and say, yeah, that was pretty good, or that was decent, but really say, Oh, wow, that was really something different. That was really technically impressive. This is not just the same old horror movie. Which is not to say that I myself necessarily had that exact reaction to Late Night in terms of how impressed I was by it, but it still must be said that besides what everyone keeps praising about it, which is as this technical achievement, where in everything from the set design of the Night Owl studio to the costumes to the presentation of the faux archival material itself, whether it's the soft, pixely, washy saturation of the broadcast itself, or on the other hand, the brief material featuring the satanic cult that looks incredibly like borderline exactly like the actual documentary Satanist by Ray Laurent. There's no getting around the fact that the evocation of historical authenticity in Late Night is quite remarkable, even if, especially as someone who was much too young to really be steeped in that era, even if you're primarily relating to it as, at best, a new high technical achievement in that kind of postmodern retro horror, where you're primarily relating to the ephemeral sense of its authenticity per the movies and popular culture of that era, and not necessarily the era itself. But besides that, besides the technical accomplishment, it really does need to be stressed that Late Night is, for the most part, once we actually get into the content of this faux archival narrative, once we're actually watching the broadcast transpire and the behind-the-scenes documentation, this is an excellently written film. There's this excellent building of tension that doesn't just feel like it's only spectacular, like we're only just biting our nails waiting for some big cliche horror film spectacle, but like we're actually finding ourselves being substantively engaged by slowly peeling back more of the character drama behind that spectacle, to say nothing of the admirable job the Cairns do to not simply using these affectations of occult fascination and satanic panic in some glib or superficial way, but actually make just as much of their movie about a seemingly quite authentic engagement with the fascination of the occult and why at this period in American history we saw such an explosion of dread and paranoia that echoes to this very day. As both directors and editors of Late Night, the Cairns have also made an excellently paced film. The structuring of the plot between these segments of the faux live broadcast and then the behind-the-scenes footage is quite well executed, even if at times the behind-the-scenes stuff feels like it reveals a little too much, feels a little too ideal in terms of what these unseen, unknown behind-the-scenes filmmakers would be able to realistically capture, and which becomes a major drawback of the film in terms of the Cairns being a little too verbose and too indulgent in their writing and not seeming to recognize a good thing where they have it, at not recognizing really that they might have everything backwards, where it should really be the live broadcast where we get the airing out of the more explicit character tensions and revelations about the supernatural background of the narrative, whereas the behind-the-scenes stuff should be where you get more suggestive, where you stand apart in that cinema verite style a little more and try to really cement that sense of dread about what is unknown and what we don't have access to. In terms of acting, the entire ensemble cast is really emboldened by the material they've been given to deliver some truly fantastic performances, where even Ian Bliss's most scene-chewing performance not only feels totally appropriate for his character, but also feels totally contextually justified by the interplay of his playing into his own micro-celebrity before these studio cameras, whereas there's a much better balance with the rest of the cast, especially Das Malkian in his much more subdued, cryptic central part, where we start to realize, again, that Late Night is a lot less about the build-up to the big horror film spectacle release of that tension and more subtly character-focused, more about getting us drawn in more and more to this guy, Jack Delroy, and understanding why he acts the way that he does and what seems to be driving him as someone who appears increasingly less like a purely cynical ratings chaser, and ironically, more and more like someone who actually has this growing obsession and passion for the occult, and in a more subtextual way, almost surreptitiously advocating for his audience, using this program as a way to expose them to these black occult truths that he's come to know so much more intimately than them. All that being said, I'm afraid that I do just have to be completely honest for how much great stuff there is in Late Night, for how excellently executed all that dramatic buildup is. The ultimate payoff for me was just entirely unremarkable, to a degree that I just feel like it didn't just undermine all of the excellent dramatic and technical work that came before it. It actually, in some ways, also led me to question its creative earnestness in retrospect. There's this really underwhelming, contradictory impulse that's informing Late Night with the Devil, where on the one hand, one is forced to acknowledge all the incredible work done to evoke a sense of period authenticity, but where the ultimate effect is just too ephemeral and surface level because the Cairns don't seem to ever be able to commit to anything. And it's not just in that behind-the-scenes black and white stuff, where the affectations of this cinema verite documentary very quickly go completely out the window and we're just watching a conventional horror film that just happens to be shot in black and white. It's also palpable throughout the entire climax of Late Night, which has been able to at least theoretically suspend this artistic notion of its channeling for exaggerated feeling of watching weird late night television and speaking to the palpable dread that can infest an impressionable viewer watching it when they're not expecting to find themselves exposed to these unanswerable questions about the very nature of the world, about whether normal people can be possessed by demons, about whether there are secret satanic groups ritually abusing children, about whether the elite capitalists and politicians of our society are actually on the side of occult evil and our media itself is simply there to pacify us into vacant, disbelieving submission. The movie is able to theoretically suspend that artistic notion of Late Night evoking that feeling of this period of popular culture, but when push finally comes to shove, doesn't attempt to do something more appropriately subversive or even anticlimactic, but instead cops out with just another big, loud, dumb, CGI-enhanced set piece of supernatural powers that just completely compromises and undermines the entire premise that what makes this period so fascinating, what makes the ephemera of late night and occult-themed popular culture so terrifying and effective is precisely that it most often doesn't end with an atom bomb going off, that it doesn't end with a spectacular cathartic release, that it keeps us to the very end strung along with the idea that there is some nefarious, otherworldly, unknown and unknowable evil that is always ever just beyond the breach of our boring, ordinary, distracted lives, and there isn't a spectacular payoff to it, that the demonic possession, that the feeling of satanic panic just keeps going and never releases us because it's always buried underneath the surface. Which brings us back to what I alluded to right at the beginning of my review, which is that the whole thing ends with this House of the Devil-esque complete aesthetic shift, where the Cairns simply abandon any pretense of technical allusion to 70s popular culture and archival media, and simply present this surreal, nightmarish climax in the stylistic idiom of contemporary genre films. And while there's still lots to praise in terms of production and costume design there, it has to be said that once the Cairns don't have period affectations to lean upon, their spectacular vision is quite boring. All of that ephemeral dread that's been built up for so long simply dissipates because now the technical aspects of how the very narrative is presented is almost entirely visually unremarkable. You still have some of that resonant attachment to character, especially to Dasmalkian's central figure, and while that can be compelling in its own right, night, again, there's this contradictory sense that the Cairns have spent so much time dealing purely in ephemera and in a larger dramatic ensemble, and now just want us to settle for something that is the opposite of ephemeral, something that is purely focused on plot content and is no longer very evocative, because now it's just one weird guy and all of his hang-ups that played better when they were merely alluded to in the context of that larger ensemble, when there was a dialectic, if you will, between his own motivations and ambitions and those of the other characters, especially Bliss as both an antagonistic but also a sort of cynical mirror of himself. And while we're on that idea of the contradictory creative impulses undermining Late Night, I suppose this is as good a time as ever to do some major and talk about the controversy surrounding this film because of its use of AI image generation. Specifically, ever since its premiere at South by Southwest Film Festival in March of last year, and especially since the first trailer for the film was released, the production of Late Night with the Devil has been dogged by the admission by the producers that AI was used in parts of the production. Now, Late Night features a good mixture of practical special effects and digital visual effects work, and what the producers have claimed is that AI was simply used as another part of the production and post-production process, and specifically only for the creation of 3 interstitial title cards that appear before the beginnings of each segment of Night Owls, and this image of the skeleton that was seen in the trailers is the most obvious example of one of these AI-generated images. This features all of the hallmarks we've all come to be familiar with when we recognize AI image generation. You'll notice that the skeleton that dominates the image doesn't have the correct number of fingers. You see this melting effect of image generation where the machine learning software can't really determine anatomical structure, so the sternum of the rib cage seems to melt into a spinal column. The lip of the jawline is also melting into the teeth. You've got this really weird effect on the right leg where the bone is just this abstract shape, and you see the same melting effect on the trees as well as on the pumpkin in the lower right corner. The image also seems to have generated these jack-o'-lanterns that are made of bone. Like the AI, obviously, just like with anatomy, it can't really determine the difference between a pumpkin and a skull. There's this floating white bone thing right here. It's really obviously an AI-generated image that, in the context of the film, you literally only see for a couple seconds at most. Now, ever since the producers clarified, or rather admitted, that AI was used in the art design of the film in any capacity at all, it's important to stress that they had to be called out on it, with an article in Variety only being published addressing the controversy in March of this year, fully a year after Late Night first premiered at South by Southwest. There's been a lot of criticism of this, especially since we just came out of 2 major film and television industry strikes in which the threat of the use of AI to eliminate or cut down on creative labor was such a key public rallying cry. But also a lot of, I think, fair skepticism that this isn't the only place where image generation was used. Since the film's release, there's also been some folks who have called attention to the backdrop of the sliding door of the Night Owl studio, where the window lights of the skyline specifically don't seem to have any coherent shape or sense of perspective, which suggests that not only might have image generation been used there, but that there might be entire aspects of the film's set that involved image generation in some capacity. Now, as far as my assessment of the use of AI in Late Night, while I can understand the broader ethical and systemic critiques of so-called artificial intelligence from a creative labor perspective, I do think it should be stressed that however much image generation was used in the production of Late Night, it's very obviously been used in conjunction with conventional production and art design. Even on the controversial skeleton title card, it's very obvious that the Night Owl Devil's logo was designed by somebody and furthermore composited by somebody into the image, which is all to say that even to the extent that AI was used on the film, I don't see it as very likely that anybody lost a job over this or got paid any less for any less time than they would have on any other production where they still have to design a logo and work on how it's going to be composited into a set design or a title card. Which makes sense because AI is mostly anyway. There is a very real and credible threat of its being used in the industry to further discipline creative labor and especially organized creative labor. But the fact is that in as much as studio executives will love to wield AI as a disciplinary cudgel, the actual results of AI look like this. And there's no way to make a movie out of this technology. There's hardly even a way to design a set with this technology. A lot of creative labor still needs to be involved in order to alter and composite this material into the overall production. In the case of Late Night, it does seem that the production was pretty much on the same page, that to whatever extent they used AI, it was only as a kind of creative intermediate. The Cairns themselves claimed their use of AI for these title cards was primarily experimental. In context, it seems rather obvious that it was a means of generating these off-looking images that you wouldn't even really have time to notice or intuit why they were off or wrong, but adds another dimension of sowing these seeds of dread in the spectator, triggering their sense of something being deeply ephemerally wrong with the images that they're looking at. So while I can appreciate the ethical critique of AI, I think it's important to stress that unless anyone is going to claim that some machine learning software clearly formally plagiarized their own work, it's important even from an ethical perspective to not be so reactionary and creatively anal retentive, because again, most AI is, as you can see from this title card, inherently wrong. It's inherently that doesn't even make any internal, coherent, formal sense. It's just the product of software attempting to mine often very general and non-specific visual data and put it together without what human beings have, which is the ability to understand that knowledge isn't just data, that things go together and achieve an identifiable look for reasons that aren't just schematic, but because we relate to and understand them in intuitive and emotional ways. It's sort of like The Fly, right? Where Seth Brundle realizes that his telepod keeps disemboweling baboons because the machine can only transfer this synthetic approximation of the component elements of what it's transporting. It doesn't know or feel like a human does about what it's supposed to come out on the other end. The machine doesn't have a vision attached to it. The machine is just looking at data, and that's not what humans do when we're creating. We're not looking at data, we're feeling resonance with something. It's like that with AI, and so when it comes to images like this skeleton, again, unless someone is going to come out and show us the specific work of popular art that this machine learning software inactively plagiarized to create this synthetic, wrong version of it, I'm sorry, this is just a danse macabre. It's a kind of image that has existed for centuries in Western popular and religious art. It's not a specific work, it's just drawn from a well of general ideas, and even if you viscerally despise the premise of using image generation at all, you can't claim an ethical objection to just drawing upon general ideas. Ideas aren't copyrightable, and they shouldn't be, and it appears with the present information we have, now that the production team of Late Night with the Devil simply used image generation as one tool in their kit of colliding aesthetic signifiers, with a decent enough creative motivation to do so, and again, without anyone having to lose a job or take a pay cut over it. That being said, as we prepare ourselves for the inevitable eventuality, as we see more filmmakers, and I think especially more low-budget filmmakers experimenting with AI as a creative intermediate, we have to be able to hold firm to a certain ethical line of critique, while also recognizing that sometimes the best critique is simply the aesthetic one. Which is to say that the use of image generation in Late Night with the Devil is thoroughly open to the most broad critique of the film overall, which is that feeling of contradictory creative motivations, of not being able to commit to anything. In the grand scheme of things, these three title cards are the least of the problems with Late Night, but it is analogous to those behind-the-scenes black and white moments or the portrayal of the satanic cult in the film as being part 70s satanic group, but also like the Branch Davidians of the 90s, or that big cop-out contemporary aesthetic shift climax. It's analogous to all of these things in that it simply comes off as an indulgence that completely undermines the best parts of the movie, neuters its potential for sustaining that deep sense of ephemeral dread, and renders everything just this loud, dumb hodgepodge of atemporal aesthetic signifiers that superficially gesture at the unknown and unknowable evil percolating in American consciousness and reflected in its popular culture, but is never really borne out, is only really grazed superficially, and so by the end of it, you just lose all bearing of what even the point of all of it was. I guess the Cairns experimentation with AI as a creative intermediate really makes sense then, because as technically impressive as various aspects of the production overall can be at times, the results are just so synthetic and disingenuous feeling. Like the Cairns themselves are the artificial intelligence mining not the feeling of an era, not the resonance of that unknown and unknowable evil and paranoia and suspicion, but just the superficial metadata of it that they then just throw together and it all just melts into each other in this inarticulate way. I want to stress that there are still many good things about Late Night with the Devil, and indeed many great things about it as a movie experience, especially if you're the sort of person who's really hankering for a mainstream horror film that is slowly paced and character focused. Then there's still a lot that you're gonna get out of this that you aren't gonna get out of most horror films, and that's not nothing. It's a great achievement. That said, I'm afraid I just can't find myself personally getting invested too much in it as a production overall. I think there's just too many points where the indulgences of the Cairns stop being fun and just become like a spectacle of two very talented creators just shooting out their own legs on what are the best qualities of their film. So I'm gonna give Late Night with the Devil what I consider to be a fair 3 out of 5. That being said, Late Night with the Devil as the first feature on my self-curated double bill of recent horror flicks fared a lot better than Immaculate, but I think I'm gonna try to modify my reputation for overlong review videos by tabling that for now and coming back in a couple of days with my full thoughts on that one. Until then, thank you for joining me. Again, please share, like, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is Ian Garcia, this is Devotional Criticism, and this was the New Movie Diary. I'll catch you guys next time.